On today's World Insight with Qian Wei, the U.S. President stands with the Saudi Crown Prince over Khashoggi's death. Business as usual for Riyadh and Washington? And what Confucius says about changes in today's world. Renowned Professor Tu Weiming weighs in.
And you try to be public-spirited, not just a privatized ego.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our show today with U.S. President Donald Trump showing solidarity with Saudi Arabia despite the kingdom and the influential crown prince in particular coming under intense international pressure over the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But Turkey insisted the killing should not be covered up. Before we get down to business, take a look at this.
We have a very strong ally in Saudi Arabia. We have an ally.
President Trump has vowed to remain a steadfast partner of Saudi Arabia. He praised the kingdom on Wednesday for helping to keep oil prices low, after earlier claiming it was better to maintain good relations with Riyadh than take action against Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman over last month's murder in Istanbul.
It's all about, for me, very simple. It's America first. Saudi Arabia, if we broke with them, I think your oil prices would go through the roof. I've kept them down.
Mr. Trump's position has flip-flopped since the murder. Besides the possible impact on low oil prices, he said Saudi Arabia's arms purchases also affected his decision. He added if Washington cut ties with Riyadh and canceled the $110 billion arms deal, global security could be threatened. According to him, other global powers will then step up to the plate and expand their defense industries. Mr. Trump's decision received wide condemnation at home and abroad. Turkey's foreign minister slammed the U.S. president's comments.
We don't see it as a political, security, or another kind of issue. We see it as an issue of solving a murder that was committed and confessed to. For us, trade or other issues are not important. This is a humanitarian issue. It is a murder. We cannot say our trade will increase. Let's cover it up. Let's ignore it.
Since Mr. Khashoggi's killing at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last month, Turkey insisted the order came from the highest levels of the Saudi government, although it has not directly accused the Crown Prince. Riyadh has denied the Crown Prince ordered the killing. The prince went on a tour of several Arab countries on Thursday, his first trip since Khashoggi's murder. He is also expected to participate in a G20 meeting in Buenos Aires at the end of the month. A transparent and credible investigation into the murder has yet to be completed, but the results of the investigation would likely put Riyadh on the defensive again.
So how are relations between Saudi Arabia and the United States as a result of the latest incidents? Let's ask our panelists with us in our Beijing studio. Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. In Washington, D.C., the U.S., we invited Morgan Muchnick, who is a U.S. Republican strategist and founder of the M2 Group, a public and government affairs firm. And in Riyadh, we have Ahmed El Ibrahim, a political and security analyst who specializes on Saudi Arabia. Gentlemen, welcome to the three of you. Mr. Muchnick, may I speak to you first about whether President Trump's latest statements and rhetorics toward Saudi Arabia really helping the United States in clearing up its interests with Saudi Arabia?
Sure. Well, first, I commend you on your first attempt at my last name. It is Muchnick. It can be a little intimidating,
wonderful.
But I get
Mr.
it.
Mr. Muchnick, I correct myself. Go ahead, sir, and answer the question. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so I personally believe that his rhetoric neither hurts nor helps. Trump's rhetoric is often very different or separate from his policies. I think sometimes we in the international sort of media, the sort of intellectual class, get too focused on the words. in the end, I would question anyone on this panel if they really think any nation would fundamentally change their international economic relationship with another country because of this situation. It's a terrible situation, and President Trump should definitely choose his words much more elegantly, but that's just not who he is. So in the end, I don't really think anyone's going to fundamentally shift their view on the issue based upon his words. They may get annoyed at the president himself, and that happens every day in this country and around the world. But in the end, the policy choices, I think, are sound. I don't really think
What are the policy choices then, Mr. Muchnick?
Well, one would be to shift the President Trump has been moving the United States policies in the Middle East away from Iran and more towards the Gulf Arab countries. And that's been going on now for a few years since the president took office. That's a pretty fundamental realignment of American national interests. And now this very terrible, awkward situation has sort of presented itself in the middle of a specific transitionary period for American foreign policy. And I don't think that there's any really appetite for American lawmakers to move America, at least on the Republican side, to move America more back towards Iran. And that's just not going to happen because of this terrible situation. So the president is in a very awkward situation, and he should probably choose his words better. But the policies themselves, I think, are sound.
Mr. Lee, Mr. Muchnick, of course, is coming from the Republican side and has been the lobbyist from the party. So, Mr. Lee, from your perspective, what are the policy choices it seems that the United States apparently is making in its relationship with Saudi Arabia, and as a result, on this incident, at least, vis-a-vis the rest of the world?
I think, our American friend has already made it very clearly. And this administration not only cherish the long-term strategic partnership with the Saudi Arabia. What is very interesting for President Bush is he added something about himself.
President Trump?
President Trump and President Trump's family, his business, so that is kind of, as some people say that, the Trump, they were wondering, it is Americans' national interests involved, or, the president, his own business, his own, interests involved in the Saudi Arabia.
So there are some blurring lines, is it, Mr. Ibrahim?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question right.
The question is whether there are blurring lines between the so-called family business and the country's national interest when it comes to President Trump's decision-making.
The United States of America is not about the President Trump or any president. It's a well-established country. It was done by, or it was founded, and the Constitution was done by the Founding Fathers. And America does not revolve on the White House or on the Congress. It's a partnership, and it's not going to be a personal issue by Trump family to do business in Saudi Arabia. What Trump did, okay, and I'm just saying the facts on the record, everything he said on his rally to become a president, the guy is implying it. He worries about the United States. He's doing his jobs. He's trying to strike deals with countries that matters in order to support the U.S. economy.
Let's talk about things not abstractly, but rather more concretely, if Mr. Ibrahim, you can. For example, about Saudi Arabia, the U.S. choices about arms sales, the U.S. choices of giving Saudi Arabia more space in terms of letting the latter guarantee about the so-called oil market. You think, from your perspective, that has been the strategic choices made by Washington?
Actually, he's making the good for the people. He's doing deals with his allies. Today, the average American citizen is
that
paying
is
a
yes to my question, or that is a no to my question, because I didn't hear your answer. Can you help me to understand your answer?
The answer is President Trump is looking after America.
All right. Looking after America from the Saudi perspective?
And if I could add...
Yes.
And also, let me go to
if I can just add quickly to that. Oh, sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Ibrahim.
No, I was just going to add to Mr. Ibrahim, this is Morgan in Washington, I was just going to add to that is that the oil prices in the United States are so low. We're going through an economic cycle where we're doing a lot of growth, and it's great in general relative to the past 7, 8, 9, 10 years. So we have a lot of demand. In spite of all this demand, our oil prices, because of supply, is going down, and that's primarily due to Saudi Arabia. For all the problems that Saudi Arabia has, and there are many, American consumers and American citizens and drivers all across the country and visitors are enjoying unprecedented ease at the oil pumps right now, and that's improving the quality of life for American industry, for airline industry, for drivers, and that's just objectively true. And there are many problems. I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about it, and there's no sort of 100% good guys or bad guys in the Middle East, in fact, not in the world. But the facts are that these economic choices that the president is making is producing quite a bit of value to the average American. That's just
let me just ask you further about that, Mr. Mushnick. Not just about the economic choices, but also, as you may know, the United States as one of the most powerful countries, the foreign policy is extremely important as well. It's going to have a ripple effect, not only for itself, but also for the rest of the world, and certainly for the region. So we see, for example, the Saudi Arabia case, but we also see the United States making moves such as regarding the Yemen issue. It was quite a few years before the Trump administration paid its attention to the Yemen issue until it became a humanitarian crisis. That is just well known to the world. And now you see that Washington and the administration had decided within just a month's time to withdraw totally from its attention in Yemen. And that is not alone the case itself. So how should we, Mr. Mushnick, if you talk about national interest, it's okay. So what exactly is the U.S. national interest? Besides the oil, besides the arms sales, what about strategically? What about foreign policy-wise in the Middle East? Could you help us to outline clearer of what is going on right now, Mr. Mushnick?
Sure. I'm happy to, and I appreciate that question. I think that's a very thoughtful question. I think the problem is that in any time a country as powerful as the United States or China or Russia, countries that have a outsized effect on the international climate, starts to make big shifts in strategic choices, it does have effects on the rest of the world. And as I mentioned briefly earlier in our discussion, the American realignment with the Gulf Arab countries, but mostly things like Saudi Arabia and the like, away from Iran, is causing a lot of changes, a lot of shifts, and some awkwardness in some of our international relationships. But that is an intermediate to long-term goal that America is undertaking, is to fundamentally shift the relationship between America and the West and Saudi Arabia. The problem is, the sort of X factor here is Turkey. Turkey used to be a strong ally of the West and used to be held up as a model of a Muslim country with democracy and the like. But over the past decade or so, Turkey has been moving away from the West and more towards Iran and that ideological worldview. And that's caused a lot of problems from an American point of view. From other places, it may
well, Turkey is one thing. We all understand that part very well. It is already very clear, that picture. We don't have to explain too much. But rather, as I said earlier, the U.S. role, not just as a national interest role, but also as an influencer of the world. For example, its withdrawal from Yemen, as I said earlier. What exactly is this overall strategy, if there is a strategy, Mr. Mushnick? That's what I want you to help us understand, if you can.
Sure. With Yemen, I would say, actually, that could be a good opportunity for the president to bring American forces maybe back into the mix a little bit to sort of soften the negative consequences of the journalist killing in Saudi Arabia. So I actually think there's probably folks in the Trump administration that are counseling the president to re-engage Yemen and to possibly work with the forces there, international forces, to try to negotiate or broker a peace. I think that could be a positive outcome for the president, because he's not going to sever ties with the kingdom. He's not going to end the relationship. but possibly putting pressure on Saudi Arabia with respect to their role in the war in Yemen could be a very positive outcome.
It's very
American
interesting, Mr.
Mashnik,
Mashnik, the way you help us to understand the situation from your perspective. Therefore, Mr. Al Ibrahim, given the fact it has been a very fluid policy coming from the current Trump administration regarding its relation with Saudi Arabia, and particular issues related to Saudi Arabia, how is Riyadh carefully chosen its approach to the current Washington, particularly an administration that is not well known for, let's just say, long-term strategic thinking?
Well, we are a long-term ally to the United States. The relationship between Saudi Arabia or Riyadh and Washington has been going up and down, but the fundamentals are really stuck together. Saudi Arabia is a replica of, let's say, Arizona. You know, the system, the military, the electrical plugs, the lights, everything, the food chains. So we're going to continue with that. Remember, whether we like it or not, America is #1 super country among two, China and Russia. So our applications, like for the long-standing partnership over 8 years, is America. We're going to continue with America. However, there's a very important aspect to that. America, or President Trump is very smart. If President Trump decide, or the Congress decide to, well, you know what, we're going to ban arms sales to Saudi Arabia, well, guess what? The market now is open. And it's better to have Saudi Arabia as an ally. Saudi Arabia and the whole thought about what happened with the Khashoggi case that it's been propagandized by the lefties around the world and make it as bigger than September 11.
Well,
you know, there are so many people killed in Syria by Bashar al-Assad, you know, over 300,000.
Well, whether people agree with you, Mr. Al Ibrahim, that's a really big issue out there. But having said that, though, what does that mean that United States to you, I mean, Saudi Arabia right now, rich oil country, United States has shale gas, and it has been very promising, its future. And the U.S. is going to have much less dependence, rather, on the oil coming from the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, which means you're going to have much less impact on the U.S. policy, at least on the issue of oil.
Well,
so, Mr. Ibrahim, how are you looking at your Riyadh policy? Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I mean, the Riyadh policy is we're going to continue. What so many people don't understand, we are the third or the fourth supplier to the United States after Canada and after Mexico. We only export less than 1 million barrels a day to the United States. This 1 million barrel can be compensated anywhere in the world, but the United States does matter to us. The United States is our strong ally and our only ally, you know, now in the West that we depend on. However, if for any hard change, you know, if the American people decide they don't like Saudi Arabia because they wear a thobe and a ghutta, or, you know, whatever it is the reason, Saudi Arabia can stand alone. Saudi Arabia is number 18 on the G20. They have a full economy. We are, you know, full sufficient. We have allies around the world. But our #1 ally is America, so we can go with the United States if they choose us to be their ally, or the whole world is open to us. You know, Prince Mohammed bin Salman is going to go to the G20, and he has the world to win. Before the Khashoggi case, and I have to mention, Saudi Arabia has always been under the gun, no matter what Saudi Arabia does, unfortunately, in this region. Even on Obama's side, we are, you know, we are unfortunately been, you know, criticized by the West for perfection. And if you go to the United Kingdom or to France or to any other countries, they have their issues. But technically, Saudi does not interfere in any country's business.
All right, certainly. The Prince going to the G20 is going to be one of those events that people are going to closely looking at. Having said that, though, Mr. Lee, listening attentively over the past 10 minutes to our colleagues from these two countries, your takeaway of the current realities of policy, Washington toward Riyadh, the other way around. Mr. Lee, briefly.
I think, you know, and since, you know, the Crown Prince and Salman were going to G20 in this, you know, Khashoggi case, would maybe, you know, stop for, you know, tentatively, and, you know, would not become, you know, larger, and gradually it will be closer, and everything would returning to a normal.
Normal meaning, Mr. Lee?
Normal, no more, there are some, pages or papers still cover this story, but generally speaking, maybe, the attention of the media will turn to some other issues rather than this issue, maybe during the last almost 2 months.
Well, Mr. Lee, of course, the attention of the media will turn to other issues as they pop up, but over the past few months, you have seen governments from other countries calling for so-called investigations about this case. Well, the U.S. also has some. Well, the president, though, are not necessarily, as some believe, that interested in what's going on with the latest of the investigation. This is also an interesting case in demonstrating how the world is seeing Saudi Arabia and whether that should be changed in the future. There are a lot of questions that needs to be asked, Mr. Mushnick. So I would love to have your takeaway as well. Would this be a storm in the teacup? Or will this be one of those important events when the U.S. is looking at its overall strategy of the Middle East, particularly, let's just say, one of those countries in those areas, Saudi Arabia, Ms. Mushnick?
My personal belief is that this president is very much a realpolitik president. And I just don't see a situation evolving such that it would cause the president to fundamentally rethink a massive strategic choice to realign America with different power players in the Middle East and moving away from Iran. I can't imagine the president completely, and the whole foreign policy establishment here in D.C., fundamentally changing that, irrespective of the outcome. As bad as that may be, the realism is that is, I think, in fact, the case. I think that it's no question that Saudi Arabia has done a good job over the past year or two with sort of a charm offensive with the West, making needed reforms with women's rights and the like, and that's all positive and it's good. This has been a very big sort of bump in the road, if you will, and it's up to Saudi Arabia to manage that on their own, to get the conversation away from this and back towards what are legitimately positive aspects that this new Saudi Arabian leadership team are doing to move it more in line with Western standards on women's rights and the like.
Morgan Mushnick, Ahmed El Ibrahim, Li Guofu, thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. What Confucius says about uncertainty and changes in today's world. Renowned Professor Tu Weiming weighs in right after this. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. With unilateralism on the rise, the debate over globalization is front and center. To make heads and tails of great uncertainty and looming conflict, we turn to philosophy and history. Back in China's Warring States period of time, before the Qin dynasty, all sorts of thoughts battled for dominance. Confucianism then was the idea whose time has come. Fast forward to modern times, in a way more complex world, could ancient Chinese philosophy help shed some light? There's no better person to answer that question than Professor Tu Weiming, one of the most well-known Confucian thinkers in centuries. When it comes to comparing Chinese philosophy with Western philosophy, Professor Tu is talking about China as an ancient living civilization.
I'm suggesting that the current chaos, as compared with the Warring States period, magnified by 1,000 times, global disorder, not to mention the the climate change, the environmental degradation, and now the incredible development of science, which may lead to the whole question of redefining humanity. So all these are major chaotic forces, and diversity is even greater. Our technologies, especially in science and communication, has enabled the global community to become a global village. And this is, in a way, our misfortune, because the village is noted for tension, conflict, and contradiction, but it is also the great fortune for the humans to think for the first time in human history as a community.
But here comes the question, Professor Tu.
Yes.
That is, China has already become the second largest economy in the world.
Right.
At least in the number.
Right.
Secondly, people are looking at China and say, what can you offer?
Right.
Besides money,
cash,
infrastructure. What about ideas?
Very deep in my heart, and in terms of my own self-reflection, it's not simply arrogance or simply wishful thinking. I do believe within Chinese culture, within especially the spiritual aspects of Chinese culture, there are a lot of resources that can very well be mobilized and enhance our understanding of the human. For example, one of the ideas in the Confucian tradition is that from the emperor to the commoner, each should regard self-cultivation as the root. The idea of self-cultivation is each human being, despite ethnicity, gender, and so forth, ought to first ask the question introspectively. How can I be a reasonable human being? How can I be friendly to others? This idea of self-improvement, self-understanding, starting from each individual, is a rich resource for the human community.
We are not seeing many of the great examples of so-called self-cultivation, as you just mentioned. So people would say, Professor, probably your thought is out of date.
It's still happening. The exceptional case indicates how precious this idea. It is not just Confucian. It is in the Christian, in the Islamic, in Hindu, all the traditions. If you want to understand yourself, you should first of all very serious about self-cultivation, about self-reflection. This is a resource that every human being has. It is not that going to be demonstrated by the leaders. And many of the leaders seem to have lost their way, and because they become political animals. They're no longer human in the genuine sense of the term. And so this is only part of the story. The other one is how to deal with another person. The principle of do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. It's a golden rule in the negative, is to say the minimum requirement for human interaction is to see to it the other receive not only your recognition but your respect. And you try to be public-spirited, not just a privatized ego, but also an open, dynamic, interchange person. So I think in a way that is, despite the challenge you just mentioned, I think it's real, it's very serious. And self-cultivation as a way of life is very widely accepted.
Professor Tu, as you may know, these days when people talk about China or the Chinese in general, they are saying, so these are smart people. They're rich, or at least they're getting richer. And it seems that in a few decades they're going to leave all of us behind. Well, they are going to be the group that's going to benefit the development of the world. And that is interesting phenomenon because you've been advocating, Professor Tu, self-cultivation, which in certain cases could mean the communications are not efficient. Because people tend to look inside, more self-cultivation, rather than increase the capability of communicating with others of exactly what your egos and your desires are. And that could lead to miscommunication, misunderstanding, and probably even bigger problems. How do you see the balance of these two?
Actually, a person is always understood as a center of relationships. It's not possible to think about a person as an isolated individual. It's not an island. So subjectivity in this connection is also intersubjectivity, your ability to think in terms of the others. The others becomes not only recognized, respected, but the dignity of the other is an end in itself rather than just a means to an end. So reciprocity in the classical sense of the term is even among family members, the father, son, husband and wife, and older and younger siblings. The relationship is always reciprocal because you have to exercise the value of considerateness. If you do not do that, that will haunt you.
Right.
And you will not be able to really sustain with your own one-dimensional approach to express your egoistic concerns. It's not your private person, but how you understand yourself as a relationship in reference to many other people with many other aspirations.
But this is what also people have been talking about.
Yes.
These days, it's not about who is having the dignity, who is having this moral high ground, but rather who is going to be the winner.
This, of course, Hobbes' idea, all human beings are involved in a kind of zero-sum game, is very common. And this is going to continue. But there are underlying rules that allow even this level of communication to happen.
Like
Otherwise,
what?
there's no communication.
Like
now,
what?
I have to say, even though we're not in a dialogical civilization, we're in a conflictual civilization, but the word dialogue actually occurs all the time, at all levels, even military confrontation. China and the United States are involving a military dialogue in order to avoid some unintended negative consequences. Now, this is, of course, a very bad example, in other words, minimum condition. And yet, for any society to survive, not to mention the global community, certain kind of rules of the game, certain kind of etiquette, certain kind of consideration will have to be there in order for the world to continue. Otherwise, there's no even communication possible, let alone dialogue.
Philosopher Professor Tu Weiming was born in Kunming, Yunnan Province, in the 1940s. He grew up in Taiwan and later studied and taught in several world-renowned institutes in the United States. Almost a decade ago, he came back to the Chinese mainland, where he's been doing humanitarian and also humanistic research ever since. Based on his vast experience at home and abroad, and from an insider and outsider's perspective, how does he see China's reform and opening up over the past 4 decades? Take a look. For 40 years, reform and opening up, China getting richer, and China getting much more respected than it used to be. But at the same time, there are daunting tasks in front of China.
Yes.
Still, probably even more. As they say, the reform has been going into the so-called deep water zone.
Right.
Is there something from China's ancient philosophy or its modern version will be able to help lead the way?
Absolutely. I think one very important idea is that China, in terms of collectively, Chinese economy is the second. But per capita, the Chinese situation is still quite miserable. And probably 100 million people are still classified as abject poverty. So how China would develop, first of all, a sense of equity, a sense of mutual responsibility. Each person's dignity has to be respected, and the people who are poor will have to be helped. And because the gap between the rich and poor in China is very serious, 10%, 90% or so.
Yeah.
And it is in this situation that China need to rethink the 5 basic values within its own tradition.
Like what?
The first one is a sense of humanity, a sense of human-heartedness, sympathy, empathy. The other one is justice, not just freedom, but also justice. And of course, civility. Civility, which is really lacking, sometimes even in ordinary human existence. And wisdom, not just accumulation of knowledge, but also wisdom and the idea to reflect about oneself all the time. And very important feature is trust. And we really, as compared with, say, Japan, with Europe, and the trust is quite deficient in China. This kind of spiritual, ethical resources are absolutely critical for sustaining not just wealth and power, but also basic equality and even basic peace and stability. And that people basically agree. The ideas that you teach your children, and hopefully your children will be able to put them into practice, are really the ideas that we need to ask, Chinese parents, Chinese leaders, Chinese entrepreneurs, successful Chinese to think about them.
But many say, Professor,
yes,
there's a fine balance between the vitality of social debates,
right,
and the stability and efficiency,
yes,
of a society.
Right.
How is that being reflected in today's China? What is that fine balance?
Right. I think there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of discussion through the internet, through which are and all kinds of other facilities. But that's not public debate. Basically, reaction to a particular incident, to a particular situation that people don't like, and there's a great deal of uproar. And this is upsurge of certain kind of anger, frustration, and this is not debate. How do we channel that mechanism? The mechanism is there, and allowing reasonable ideas to be expressed. Not only allowing reasonable ideas to be expressed, allowing certain kind of critical spirit to be cultivated. This critical spirit, self-cultivation actually means you'll be able to criticize yourself. It's very important not to develop a certain kind of self-congratulatory notion about your greatness because you certainly feel that you're rich enough to be able to outsmart others. And this is the idea of humbleness, humility. Is very, very critical for the Chinese community as a whole.
Professor Tu, before we go, several important words that I would like to share with you. For example, confidence. How confidence is being built, reflected, but at the same time make sure it is not going to become a force of self-satisfaction. Confidence and humbleness.
Right.
This right balance.
Right. Confidence and arrogance are really in conflict. Confidence is based upon inner strength. And again, I return to the idea of cultivation. The cultivation is a way of understanding who I am. And even though I fail to perform well in some other areas, but there's always the possibility of recharge the energy. But also recognize this is not my privilege. This is my responsibility. Many other people deserve the same kind of respect. And therefore, how you'll be able to learn the best from all over the world, at the same time you have some confidence that your direction is correct. These two are interconnected. If they're separate, then you lose not only your own confidence, but also your ability to continue to learn and relearn.
Professor Tu, last but not least, in Confucianism,
right,
one of the most important things is to make sure that people aspire to become a noble person.
Right.
君子. Now, today's world, what are some of the most important qualities if you call someone a 君子, a noble person, or a people, a noble people?
And first of all, it's a sense of person with dignity. Commander of the three armies can be snatched away. The will of a commander cannot be snatched away. If you will that no matter at what kind of political or social stratification, you want to be a person that you feel not only comfortable with, but proud. And you want to be the best kind of person you want to become. This is the idea of learning to be human. And to Lu Xiangsan talk about to establish that which is great in us. Every human being, man, woman, old and young and so forth, all have the will that I want to be a better human being. And I want to be a better human being not as an isolated individual. It's against extreme form individualism. I want to be a human being because I can communicate fruitfully, meaningfully to other human beings.
Yes.
And we can grow and flourish together.
Professor Tu, what a pleasure talking to you. I learned so much today. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Really
I
appreciate it.
Yeah.
谢谢。Professor Tu Weiming, a philosopher and certainly one of those representative figures of so-called New Confucianism. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. And it's the end of the work week. Enjoy your weekend. See you back here on Monday. Bye for now.